In this country, 7 times as many women die of heart disease as die of breast cancer. Estrogen can decrease the risk of serious heart disease by 50%.
I'm Jill Angelo, host of the Genneve podcast series for women's health in midlife. I speak with the most forward-thinking experts in the health and wellness industries. These experts are helping women 40 plus feel confident and in control of their health in the most vibrant years of their lives. So join us on this journey of women's health. In 2002, the Women's Health Initiative released a study claiming that hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, increased a woman's risk of developing breast cancer. Almost overnight, the use of HRT dropped significantly, leaving many women with few alternatives for managing their menopausal symptoms. At Genneve, we're taking a position to dig in and bring you the facts on HRT. Geneve's Director of Health, Dr. Rebecca Dunsmoor-Su, and I had a chance to sit down with oncologist Dr. Avrum Bluming and social psychologist and feminist Dr. Carol Tavris. They're the authors of Estrogen Matters. It's a factual study of hormone replacement therapy, where they take on the Women's Health Initiative study, arguing that not only it was wrong on many accounts, but that by encouraging women to stop taking HRT, it did real damage to women's quality of life and long-term health. Listen in. This is one of my favorite conversations of all time. I learned so much, and you will too. My first question is for Dr. Bluming and Dr. Tavris. Just very simply, what led you to write the book, Estrogen Matters?
Well, I've been a medical oncologist for decades. About 60% of my practice has been devoted to breast cancer, and I've watched the field progress so that we are now at the point where newly diagnosed breast cancer is cured in a little over 90% of patients, which is terrific. And then I followed these patients to see if the breast cancer recurred, and although the breast cancer didn't recur, they were complaining of problems, symptoms that were associated either with their aging past the point of menopause, or because of the medicines that I gave them, they were induced into premature menopause. And they complained of many symptoms. And my reaction was, well, you're alive, and women are generally supposed to suck it up. And although I didn't say it that way, that was clearly the message. And the symptoms became more and more prominent, and I started to look into what might be done for the symptoms. And hands down, the thing that works best is estrogen. Nothing comes close. The symptoms, and we can get into them, are extensive. They seriously affect the quality of life. They will affect about 85% of women who reach menopause. And although we are told that they last maybe 2 years or less, more than half of the women will have them for more than 8.5 years. And so I started to look at whether or not we could help these symptoms. And clearly estrogen at the time was verboten, because we all assumed that estrogen causes breast cancer. And the last thing I wanted to do as an oncologist is cause a recurrence of the breast cancer. And then I started challenging some of the truisms we were told, which is that the earlier you reach menarche and the later you reach menopause, the greater your risk of breast cancer. That's not true. I was told if a woman takes estrogen, she should take it in the lowest dose for the shortest period of time. There are no data supporting that widely proposed statement. And so I looked deeper into what estrogen could do, hence Estrogen Matters, and I was impelled to write the book after numerous discussions with Carol.
Which brings me to my motive in working with Avrum on this book. The two of us share a passion for what science teaches us and how it can inform our decisions. And also an understanding that very often what science tells us if it requires us to give up something we believe, people don't respond with, "Why, thank you, Dr. Bluming, for this incredibly important information. I will change my mind about estrogen immediately," okay? They tell you where you can go with your stupid study. Am I right? So as a social psychologist, I've long been interested in why people don't change their minds when the evidence suggests that they should. And as a feminist, the bottom line for me always has been, what is best for women? When I started out as a young social psychologist, I had two passions, science and feminism. And in those times, feminism made science better by illuminating its biases and the way women had been excluded and the questions that were not being asked and so forth. And at its best, science should also help us with our feminist goals. What is best for women, for women's health and well-being? I never took HRT. I have no vested interest personally in defending whether I did or didn't take it. Avrum has no vested interest in this either in any financial or conflict of interest way, which is important to mention, by the way. But I found myself in the position of so many feminist women and scientists faced with the evidence that HRT was not the demon we thought. And I say this coming from someone who has spent a lot of time criticizing big pharma, criticizing the effort to medicalize our lives and take a pill for every little thing that comes along. I understand fully the arguments that women have made against HRT. And so for me, it was both a surprise, a wake-up, and rather exciting to face my own hesitations and doubts and listen to the data that Avrum was providing me.
Dr. Rebecca, as an OBGYN, I'd love your response to that because, like Avrum and Carol said, their interest in this is not based upon, like the symptoms you all are addressing in the book were not the core thing that you were out to solve, as an oncologist or as a psychologist. And so, Dr. Rebecca, as an OBGYN that faces women with these symptoms every day, what's your response?
I just want to say thank you so much for writing this book. I think as an OBGYN, I wear multiple hats. I am also a feminist. I'm also a scientist, and I have a degree in biostatistics and epidemiology. And I too see this sort of struggle in the scientific community where we try to make our science match our preconception rather than letting our preconceptions go when the science doesn't match. And as an OBGYN, I agree with you. Menopausal symptoms do not last 2 years, except in the rarest of cases. I think there are rare women for whom hot flashes last 2 years, but that doesn't take into account the brain fog, the depression, the joint difficulties, all the other signs and symptoms of menopause that may start early in the perimenopause and last well beyond the last period. And these are major issues for women and major things that have huge impact on their life. And it doesn't do you any good to survive a survivable breast cancer only to be miserable for 10 to 15 years. Especially if there's no reason why you need to be. If there is a good way to solve these issues, and a safe way, then we need to be discussing that. And I see the biggest place where I see this, so I do a lot of sexual function medicine, and I cannot tell you how many women come to me who've had DCIS or a stage 1 breast cancer and won't even take vaginal estrogen, even though for the most part everybody agrees that that's safe. They've been so ingrained with this idea that breast cancer is entirely estrogen driven when it's really not true.
It's just worth mentioning that although hot flashes and night sweats are what most women know about, the difficulty sleeping, insomnia, difficulty concentrating, difficulty with recent memory, decreasing energy reserve, bladder and urinary discomfort, loss of sexual desire, vaginal dryness, vaginal discharge. Rebecca mentioned that depression and sadness, tension, mood swings, headaches, the list is extensive and also includes things like palpitations, which many cardiologists aren't aware of, thinning hair, and even weight gain around the abdomen, which is clearly something women are concerned about and can't shake. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's important to know the good things that estrogen does before we get into the warning signs that women are made aware of. In this country, 7 times as many women die of heart disease as die of breast cancer. And when I tell that to women, what they usually say is, sure, but old women die of heart disease and young women die of breast cancer. But in fact, in every decade of a woman's life, her risk of dying of heart disease is greater than her risk of dying of breast cancer. And that difference increases as a woman gets older and older. And estrogen can decrease the risk of serious heart disease by 50%. That's enormous. In 1991, Lee Goldman, who was then a professor of cardiology at Harvard and who's currently the dean at Columbia Physicians and Surgeons, advocated using estrogen in 1991 in a lead editorial in the New England Journal to help prevent death from heart disease. The major cause of death among women with breast cancer is heart disease, not breast cancer. And while statins are usually advised, and in men they do prevent an initial heart attack, in women they don't. And women aren't even aware of that, nor are many physicians.
Well, I think so often what we see is that, and this is a big issue in all medical studies done on men are extrapolated to women for no good reason. I love it. There's a book you quote in your book that has the title, "Women Are Not Small Men." Because we are not. We are different. We are physiologically different people. And studies need to be done on women that show what medications do in women. And I think the statins is a huge issue. And I think that's never been made really public. I think most women who are on statins think that they're on them because it's going to prevent a heart attack.
And one strong advocate of that, if I could just interrupt this for a minute, is Bernadine Healy, who is the first and so far only female director of the National Institutes of Health, made that point very strongly, and she is the one who advocated studies on women for women, and she would turn over in her grave if she knew what happened with the Women's Health Initiative that she helped initiate. In her book about menopause, she wrote, cardiologist, when she reaches menopause, she will start it without a blink. Hormones, that is.
I want to add one other thing, because it's such a common notion that there's something unnatural about taking hormones in menopause. So let's address this for 1 second, if we might. As Barbara Sherman, who studied the effects of estrogen on brain function, said, "What's not natural is for women to live 30 years after menopause. That's what's not natural. I want to continue taking HRT for brain function and for the other benefits that estrogen provides well into old age." And what's, I think, also about this not natural business is that I certainly was under the impression that at menopause, estrogen declines a little bit, the way testosterone declines somewhat among men. I was truly stunned to learn that estrogen doesn't just decline, it plummets to 1% of what it was prior to menopause. 1%? That's not a depletion, that's an emptying the tank. And so it's not exactly that we're just, filling up the tank. It is we really are replacing so much of that beneficial hormone that's lost in menopause.
I think you make a very good point there, Carol, is that, there's so much talk about what is natural, what is not natural, and there's so much value and judgment placed on the use of estrogen. And it's a medication, it's a hormone, it's a body hormone. There's no value, there's no judgment. You need to do what is best for your body in your life, and not be judged by others or judged even by yourself. about that. And I think, it's interesting you guys note in your book that, as late as 1900, very few women lived very far beyond the menopause. This wasn't an issue. But we have vastly extended the range of our lives. And that is going to come with both joys and complications.
Yes, exactly. It is such an interesting thing, this natural business. Everybody wants natural, including herbs that might have harmful effects, medications that do or do not. But also it's so funny to me, we've not just had critics from people who think, oh, HRT, what a terrible thing, but also from people who are mad at us for not only endorsing bioidenticals, a word that is really funny. It's identical but not the same. And what, of course, it means is that women know that estrogen is beneficial, so who can provide it for us in a way that allows us to think we're not actually taking a medication, we're doing something natural, but they know that estrogen helps. So find me a way to take it that allows me to think it's natural.
And it's funny because I'm an obstetrician gynecologist, so I also have a hand in the OB world. And one of the things I tell women often is that, yes, labor and delivery is a natural and normal process that used to kill 1 in 20 women. Just because it's natural doesn't mean something is safe. And arsenic is a totally natural product, but you wouldn't take it. It's not safe. We need to dissociate those two things. And I think we're thinking in terms of an organic fruit, not in terms of a medication.
We're talking just about heart disease. If we could move just for a minute to osteoporosis, what most people aren't aware of is that as many women die of osteoporotic-related hip fracture in this country every year as die of breast cancer. That's frightening. And in postmenopausal osteoporosis, and we go into this in detail in the book, calcium and vitamin D do nothing to help stimulate normal bone development. Estrogen decreases the risk of osteoporotic hip fracture by 50%. Just that would be enough to look at it seriously, and that's just ignored. And Alzheimer's disease, for every woman who develops breast cancer in her perimenopause years, 2 will develop Alzheimer's, and Alzheimer's disease has no cure rate. There is very little, if anything, regardless of what you hear on commercial television, that really helps that kind of cognitive decline, except estrogen, which can decrease the incidence of serious cognitive decline by between 25% and 60%. That's enormous. And if there's anything that women fear more than breast cancer, it's Alzheimer's disease.
It's interesting you bring this up because, as you guys are surely aware, there was this large sort of database study that came out a few weeks ago into the press about Alzheimer's disease and estrogen, where they noted a slight increase in the incidence, and very slight, I might add, given the numbers, in the incidence of Alzheimer's disease in women who had ever taken HRT. And, I had a conversation with Jill at the time to put out on our website that said, we need to think about where this study is coming from. It's a, large study. It's a retrospective database study. We don't know why the women started the HRT that they started. We don't know how long they took it. And I think your research into estrogen and Alzheimer's shows that, it's not just, I took it for a year and now I've fixed my risk of Alzheimer's. It's something you need to take for a long time to modify that risk.
Well, first of all, by the way, I just wanted to comment. I mean, since you're did you say biostatistician?
Well, I'm an epidemiologist. I have a degree in epidemiology, but did a lot of statistics as part of that degree.
Yes, well, okay, good. But then, the problem, of course, with epidemiology and why we are at such pains to examine in our book the studies that dispute our point of view, our findings. Find a massive amount of evidence on one side, but we have carefully examined studies that come along that seem to dispute our findings. And over, what we have found was what what appeared to us was a way of manipulating the data, over-exaggerating the findings to create more alarm rather than reassurance. So I really appreciate your taking the time to examine that study carefully.
We looked at animal studies, we looked at cellular studies on estrogen when we're dealing with brain function, and we looked at clinical studies, and we've heavily referenced everything we say in the book. So we're not asking people to believe us, we're simply asking them to look at the data and then work with their physicians to work out what seems to be best for them.
Why is it so hard to get the word out and to change mindsets?
Well, there is a book that Carol wrote before she wrote this one called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. A wonderful book. Carol, you want to say something about what we're dealing with here?
It is an annoying but persistent habit of the human mind to not want to be wrong. And for the most part, when we come to a belief, it's efficient for us to maintain that belief, to look for evidence that confirms that belief and shows how right we are in holding that belief, and to reject and minimize and forget and distort information that disconfirms our belief or makes us question it. In medicine, of course, this means that you need, stacks and stacks of evidence before anyone might begin to change their minds, as happened in the case of replacing the mastectomy with the lumpectomy. But there are so many examples in medicine. But it doesn't happen easily, and especially when physicians have been practicing something or believing in something for a long period of time. They see themselves as good, competent, compassionate physicians who are doing the best for their patients, and now you come along and tell me that I'm doing something that isn't the best for my patient. I'm denying them HRT when that really could be of benefit for their whole entire lives. Well, piss off with you, And so they're not doing it out of ignorance or obstinacy or malevolent motives. This is a natural process of the human mind. And it's one of the reasons that science is so annoying to so many people, because science is one of the most effective methods we have of forcing us to test our beliefs against the data. And so many of us just don't want to hear that our beliefs need to change when they do. So I think that's one reason. And I would say another reason is that we are a culture that pays attention to bad news. Bad news sells. Scary news sells. If I can scare women about estrogen, and the Women's Health Initiative that first put out the scare about HRT basically said this: we wanted to make a dent in the news cycle. How are you going to make a dent if you have a press conference that says, okay, everybody, keep taking HRT, it's perfectly fine?
Well, I think there are two important things that you bring up there. And I think that not only do we as physicians not want to be told that we have been doing the wrong thing, I think often as researchers we're just as vulnerable to those mindsets. We go into any research project that we start with preconceived notions. Sometimes we call them hypotheses, but they are preconceived notions. And it depends, especially folks who have a long history of excellent research and who are leaders in their field, tend to take their own preconceived notions a little more seriously and may find in their data something that confirms that notion, even if it doesn't appear to be there on first look. And they do that by looking deeper, which is something that epidemiologists call dynamining, which is not something you're supposed to do, but yet it seems to always happen.
Well, I want to emphasize one of the things that we found in Mistakes Were Made is that it is the people who see themselves as the most competent, the most successful, the smartest, who have the hardest time very often changing their mind, because it's such an uncomfortable, dissonant realization that I, who am the best at this, and you're telling me I've made a mistake. Well, so it's very, very difficult to have a conviction, which we all need, as Avrum has pointed out, as a physician. You must hold beliefs firmly enough to know that you are doing what you believe is best for your patient. And you must also be willing to hold those ideas lightly enough so that if better evidence comes along, you're willing to accept that better evidence. That's a difficult challenge for all of us, not just for physicians.
Carol had a very interesting experience where she was talking to a woman with recently diagnosed breast cancer who was feeling guilty that she had taken hormones. And Carol tried to reassure her that she didn't cause it herself. And the woman, Carol, said...
The woman turned to me and said, "But don't you see, I want to believe that HRT caused my breast cancer because that gives me something I can do to avoid a recurrence by stopping it. She understood what that belief was doing for her.
And there's so much fear in our culture about breast cancer, and I think it's really important to stop and have a conversation with women. I think it's important to point out, like you did at the beginning of this interview, that 90% of breast cancer is curable nowadays. But heart disease isn't necessarily. Osteoporosis is not necessarily, and those things are going to kill more women.
And that's why I was so interested in the book, to discover so many women are living for so long after being treated for breast cancer that now there's a new specialty, cardio-oncology, which is to help the breast cancer survivors who are at risk of heart problems.
And while many physicians are aware of the incorrect statement that early menarche and late menopause increase the risk of breast cancer, which isn't verified, and we review that in the book, they don't know that pregnancy before the age of 20, and we're not encouraging that, which floods the body with estrogen, decreases the risk of subsequent breast cancer by 75%. That women who give birth to many children have a lower incidence of breast cancer than women who don't give birth to any children. We used to say that pregnancy after breast cancer is verboten because you are now flooding the body with estrogen. And I was one of the physicians who recommended abortions to women who got pregnant either while they were diagnosed with breast cancer or after they had breast cancer. And what we now know from looking at data is abortion does not improve the prognosis in newly diagnosed breast cancer. There's even one study showing that it may decrease the prognosis. And pregnancy after breast cancer, if it does anything, may actually improve the prognosis of breast cancer. So that so many of the data points that we can now point to are simply ignored by people who don't want to know them because they conflict with a belief system that they already have.
What is it going to take to break through and change these mindsets? Obviously, it has to happen at all levels, but we're talking about, will women believe the science? Will they want to change their minds? Who will they, what do you think is the golden ticket to start to drive change and attitude change and reduce the fear that exists today?
You, basically, you. That is the way to do this. There are already many physicians, oncologists, gynecologists, and so forth, who are open to this evidence and who are on our side, if you will. But really, it has to come more from resources that women can go to get this information online. That's where people go, where they can get information, where they can be directed. Ideally, we would love it if they'd find our book to give them some information about this, to review the information. But it has to come from the blogs, the websites, the organizations devoted to women's health and getting the best information to women's health. So it has to come both from medicine down and from consumers up. And word of mouth is already what is most helping us. We did not get the reviews in the major newspapers that we were expecting, but as women have been hearing what Avrum has to say about this, as women have been listening to these arguments, it's woman to woman to woman, which is the way so much of this proceeds.
What we were saying to Rebecca before we started the interview is we are now seeing women starting to hold hands around the world. We are getting letters from England, France, Australia, New Zealand, Chiang Mai, Thailand, Germany, and many states in the United States of women, some of whom say, I was crying when I read your book, that somebody finally heard me. On Amazon's list, which I check compulsively for no reason at all, we are now the number two selling book on menopause, which is not bad. It's nowhere near enough. And what we need is to get the word out by working, Jill, together.
And Jill, the other really important thing, one of the questions that Avrum gets all the time is, I live in Idaho, I live in Wyoming, I live in wherever I'm living.
I live in Manhattan.
I live in Manhattan. Can you recommend a doctor for me? I want to go back on HRT. I want to take HRT. Can you find me a doctor? So clearly there is a great need for a national referral service for doctors to sign into who are willing to do so.
Yeah, and I think, one of the great things about Genneve and the network we're building is we do make sure these are physicians who are not afraid of HRT. There is no reason to fear this medication, and it is life-saving and life-changing for many women, and we need to understand that. Before we end this recording, I do want to talk a little bit about the Women's Health Initiative, or the WHI study, because I think that's the one that always comes up when you're talking to a woman about hormones in your office, or when you're talking to other physicians about hormones. And I think that there was the initial scare that came out, and then yet they never seemed to republicize the fact that their findings went away.
Mistakes were made, but not by them. That's basically what their view is. They have been backtracking on many points from their original findings. They've actually grumpily agreed that HRT is good for menopausal symptoms, and they've grumpily agreed that it's okay to use vaginal estrogen for sexual problems. And okay, it doesn't actually kill you. It actually does extend longevity by several years. But quietly, and I really would say grumpily, they don't make a fanfare out of this good news, because it would mean that they would have to also say, how we stopped the presses because we said that HRT increases the risk of breast cancer. Well, actually what we found out is that wasn't statistically significant, and actually that finding kind of went away after a while. And
it's worse than that. It's worse than that. I invited one of the principal investigators of the Women's Health Initiative to speak at my local hospital in Los Angeles about 6 months after that publication was responsible for a decrease in the frequency of hormone prescriptions from something like 40% of women to less than 5% of women. And he was asked by one of the doctors in the audience, it seems to me that the data you just presented to us, the data which has resulted in a profound impact on women's health, doesn't contain statistically significant findings. And his answer was, this is a study that will eventually cost $1 billion. It's the most expensive study ever done, and we will never be able to repeat it. And so if we think that the numbers suggest something and the numbers don't quite add up, and this is the quote, the statistical police have to leave the room. And there was absolute silence among that medical audience. And he never apologized for that shameful statement. And never mind statistical significance, which, as Carol pointed out, didn't really hold up. And instead of publishing it as the lead article in JAMA, it was published in a much smaller publication without any headlines showing that the statistical significance had disappeared. They've never stood up and taken responsibility for unquestionable harm that they have done to women around the world. And this isn't just one oncologist and one social psychologist talking from a remote corner in the United States. Our book is endorsed by Vince DeVita, who was the director of the National Cancer Institute, by Jerome Cassira, who was the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, by Michael Baum in England, who was one of the leading cancer investigators in the world, especially about breast cancer, by Leslie Turnberg, who was the president of the Royal College of Physicians, and I could go on, but by very responsible people who, like the women around the world, have been holding hands now for several years, saying somehow we've got to get this message out.
Rebecca, I would add one important point, because we really do want physicians to know what the major problems were with the Women's Health Initiative. And to that end, at the end of the book, we have 10 important takeaways about the Women's Health Initiative that every physician needs to know about it. How unrepresentative the sample was, how distorted the findings were, how the findings kept contradicting each other, how only 3 of the 40 principal investigators were involved in that first Stop the Presses study, how they rammed that study into the Journal of the American Medical Association without most of the investigators even knowing the findings. There were so many things wrong with the way the study was analyzed and reported. It was really a disgrace to the scientific enterprise.
I think those are really, really important points. And I think, from an epidemiology perspective, yes, a randomized controlled trial is what we hold up as the best study you can do. But a study is only as good as the inclusion and exclusion criteria and the population it represents. And I think even when that WHI first came out and everybody was trying to rush to read it and understand it, immediately people saw that these were not women who had started on hormone at their perimenopause or right at menopause, like we start women on hormone. These were women who were recruited 10, 15, 20 years out from their menopause to restart a hormone, and that made no sense. The whole premise of the study made no sense.
And, what came out of that study was, even if it wasn't statistically significant, there was a 26% increased risk of breast cancer among women who took not estrogen alone, which wasn't associated with an increased risk, but women who took estrogen and progesterone. First, that increased risk means that instead of 5 per 100, there might be 6 per 100 who got breast cancer, and women who were diagnosed with breast cancer on hormones have been found to have a better prognosis. But more than that, when you look at the controls that they used for that, the estrogen alone did not show an increased risk of breast cancer. If you look at the estrogen plus progesterone with the control group in estrogen alone, there was no increased risk, not 26%, it was 0. And the control group that they used for that combination somehow had a lower risk of breast cancer than the standard control group, and that generated their 26%, which didn't even hold up over the next 4 years. It's really a faulty study. And to show you their prejudice, in 2003, that same group came out with a report saying that hormones have no effect on women's quality of life. And the question is, what planet were they writing for? And they say in their article that they knew that women who were symptomatic would not agree to participate in a double-blind randomized trial because within 4 days, they'd know if they were taking hormones and they would drop out of the study. So they purposely excluded symptomatic women. And surprise, these women who had no symptoms had no improvement in the symptoms they didn't have. And Gina Colada wrote a lead editorial in the New York Times saying not only does estrogen cause breast cancer, it doesn't even improve quality of life.
On that note, I just have to underscore, read the book. You guys have given us so many points today for any woman who wants to get informed and take this fear and uncertainty head on around hormone therapy. You've created an amazing resource. So thank you both, Dr. Avrum and Dr. Carroll. Thanks, Dr. Rebecca, for bringing the OBGYN and epidemiologist view to this discussion. But what a valuable resource. And we as Genneve, we will certainly uphold it as a go-to resource course, but we want to be that place of safe and trusted practitioners that you can refer women to actually get their questions answered. And if it's right for them, secure a prescription for hormone therapy so that they can live a better life.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Rebecca. Wonderful, wonderful.
And I also want to once again emphasize, just so we can make sure that everybody hearing this podcast understands it, none of the three of us are paid in any way, shape, or form by the pharmaceutical companies. None of us take money from any of these companies. None of us earn any money anytime we prescribe hormone. We're doing this because we think it's actually a good thing for women. And, we're as frustrated as all women at the increases in price in hormones and all the tricks that the pharmaceutical companies use to keep them expensive. But they are good medication.
And we are trying to empower women, not set up a mail order program so that they can get hormones, but empower them so that they can participate with their physicians in choosing the right course for them.
Exactly. And live their best lives through to their 80s and 90s and even hundreds nowadays.
On that note, thanks, everybody.
Thank
you
all.
guys. It was lovely to meet you.
Thank you.
That concludes our lively conversation with the authors of Estrogen Matters, Dr. Avrum Bluming and Dr. Carol Tavris. You can learn more about their book, the authors, their research, and the Women's Health Initiative study at the website sciencebasedmedicine.org/Estrogen Matters. Again, that's sciencebasedmedicine.org/Estrogen Matters. Thanks again for listening in, and we look forward to the next time. Thanks for listening to the Genneve podcast series. We welcome your feedback at genneve.com. That's GENNEVE.com. You can follow us on Facebook and subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher, and you'll never miss an episode. The Genneve podcast series is produced by Shannon Perry, theme music by Smitty. And until next time, watch the Genneve website for new stories and offers all dedicated to women's midlife health.